Welcome, weary travellers, to tonight's exploration of one of humanity's most enduring and entertaining pastimes. Tonight, we delve into the curious world of petty feuds. Those magnificent displays of human stubbornness that transform neighbours into sworn enemies over the placement of a trash can, colleagues into bitter rivals over a stapler, and family members into warring factions over who ate the last piece of pie. You see, if aliens were to study our species, they might conclude that humans possess an almost supernatural ability to turn the most trivial irritations into epic sagas worthy of Shakespeare. Except Shakespeare never wrote about the great parking space war of suburbia, or the case of the stolen lunch from the office refrigerator. Let us begin our journey through the annals of human pettiness, where mountains are regularly made from molehills, and where the phrase, "it's the principle of the matter," has launched 1,000 ridiculous battles. Chapter 1. The Sacred Territory of the Parking Space. Picture, if you will, a quiet suburban street. Maple Avenue, let's call it, tree-lined, peaceful. The kind of place where the most exciting event should be Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning roses, but no. On Maple Avenue, a war has been brewing for 3 years. A war over 18 inches of asphalt. The combatants: Harold Jenkins, 64, retired postal worker, and Susan Martinez, 42, dental hygienist. The battlefield: the space in front of Harold's house where his driveway meets the street. The weapon of choice: traffic cones. It began, as these things often do, with what psychologists call territoriality and what the rest of us call being ridiculous about stuff that doesn't matter. Harold had grown accustomed to parking his 2018 Honda Civic in that particular spot. Not in his driveway, mind you. That was reserved for his wife's car. No, this was about the street space directly in front of his mailbox. Susan, who lived 2 houses down, occasionally parked there when visiting her elderly neighbour, Harold noticed. Harold did not approve. Harold decided to take action. First came the polite note. "Dear neighbour," it read, "I would appreciate it if you would avoid parking in front of my house, as this is where I typically park my vehicle." A reasonable request, you might think. After all, it's just a parking space. There are others. But here's where we encounter one of humanity's most peculiar traits: the transformation of preference into principle. Susan didn't see Harold's request as reasonable. She saw it as presumptuous. The street, she correctly noted, was public property. No one owns the space in front of their house. And so began what the neighbours would later refer to as the Great Cone War. Harold's next move was to purchase orange traffic cones, 4 of them. He placed them strategically around his parking space each morning before leaving for his daily walk. Susan, arriving to visit her neighbour, would move the cones to the sidewalk and park anyway. Harold, returning from his constitutional to find the cones displaced and his space occupied, escalated. He added reflective tape to the cones. Then small flags. Then a handwritten sign, reserved for resident parking. Susan responded by purchasing her own cones, bright pink ones. She began placing them in the space overnight, claiming it for her own use the following day. The neighbours called it the Cone Wars and began taking sides based on complex allegiances involving prior disputes over holiday decorations and leaf-blowing schedules. The city, when finally called to mediate, informed both parties that no one owned street parking and that traffic cones cannot be used to reserve public spaces. Both Harold and Susan nodded solemnly, agreed completely, and continued the cone war the very next day. 3 years later, Harold and Susan have never spoken directly to each other. They communicate exclusively through cone placement, increasingly elaborate signage, and occasionally passive-aggressive Facebook posts about entitled neighbours that don't mention anyone by name but include enough context clues to make their meaning crystal clear to anyone within a 6-block radius. The anthropologist Margaret Mead once wrote that you could judge a civilization by how it treated its most vulnerable members. She clearly never witnessed 2 grown adults wage psychological warfare over a parking space. Because if she had, she might have added, and you can judge individual sanity by how seriously someone takes imaginary property rights to 18 inches of public asphalt. But Harold and Susan are not alone in their dedication to parking-related conflict. Oh no! The human capacity for parking pettiness knows no bounds. Consider the case of the Williamson apartment complex where Janet Kowalski maintained a 3-year feud with her upstairs neighbour over assigned parking spaces. The complex had a policy. Tenants were assigned specific numbered spots. Janet had spot 23. Her upstairs neighbour Doug had spot 24. The trouble began when Doug started parking 3 inches over the line into Janet's space. 3 inches. Approximately the width of a smartphone. Janet left a note. Doug ignored it. Janet left another note, this one with diagrams. Doug began parking 4 inches over the line. What followed was a masterclass in escalation. Janet purchased chalk and began drawing precise outlines around Doug's car. Doug bought an even larger car. Janet started taking photographs and sending them to the property management company. Doug began leaving his car windows open during rainstorms, claiming Janet's harassment was affecting his mental health. The property manager, a woman named Beth who had dealt with noise complaints, pet disputes, and the occasional domestic disturbance, would later say that the parking space conflict was the most emotionally draining situation she'd encountered in 15 years of property management. Janet and Doug's feud ended only when Doug moved out, leaving behind a forwarding address that Janet definitely didn't Google to check if his new apartment complex had assigned parking. It didn't. One wonders what future anthropologists will make of our parking space obsessions. Perhaps they'll theorise that automobiles were actually sacred objects, and parking spaces were religious shrines. It would explain the devotion, the ritualistic behaviour, and the utter unwillingness to compromise. Chapter 2: The Trashcan Chronicles. If parking spaces represent humanity's territorial instincts, then trashcan disputes reveal something even more primal: our relationship with boundaries, respect, and the fundamental question of what constitutes yours versus mine. Meet the Hendersons and the Patels. Neighbours on Elm Street for 8 years, friends for 7 years and 11 months, and bitter enemies for exactly 1 month. The source of their enmity? A brown plastic wheelie bin. It began on a Tuesday, trash day. The Patel's bin was full, their teenage son having cleaned out his room and filled it with what appeared to be 3 years' worth of energy drink cans and homework assignments. Mrs. Patel, seeing the Henderson bin with some extra space, added 1 small bag of overflow trash. Mr. Henderson noticed. Mr. Henderson had feelings about this. Strong feelings. Now you might think, it's trash. It's going to the same place. What difference does it make which bin it goes in? You would be thinking rationally. Mr. Henderson was not thinking rationally. He was thinking about principles, about boundaries, about the social contract that governs suburbia. The next week, Mr. Henderson waited by his window. Sure enough, Mrs. Patel approached with another small bag. This time, Henderson was ready. He emerged from his house like a suburban sentinel, wearing his bathrobe and his dignity. "Excuse me," he said, with the measured tone of a man who has rehearsed this moment. "That's my bin." Mrs. Patel, genuinely surprised, explained about the overflow situation. It was just one small bag. The bin wasn't even full. She'd be happy to reciprocate if the Hendersons ever needed extra space. But Henderson was already deep in the grip of what psychologists call territorial behaviour and what neighbours call being weird about trash. He explained that he paid for garbage service. The bin was his responsibility. If everyone just put trash wherever they wanted, it would be chaos. Mrs. Patel, being a reasonable person, apologised and took her bag away. She also began to question whether she really knew her neighbour as well as she'd thought. Henderson, victorious in defending his bin, felt satisfied for exactly 48 hours. Then he started thinking about what might have been in that bag. What if it was something that would make his trash smell? What if the Patels had been using his bin regularly without him noticing? What if this was part of a larger pattern of disrespect? These thoughts festered like garbage left too long in the sun. The following week, Henderson installed a small padlock on his trash bin. Not a big lock, just a statement lock. The kind that says, "I am a person who locks his trash." The Patels noticed. Their teenage son, Raj, asked the question that cut to the heart of the matter. Why would someone lock their garbage? It was a fair question. What exactly was Henderson protecting? His refuse, his coffee grounds, his discarded mail? But the lock was just the beginning. Henderson began to monitor the neighbourhood trash situation with the dedication of a wildlife researcher. He noticed that the Johnsons, 2 doors down, occasionally put out extra bags next to their bin. He observed that Mrs. Chen across the street sometimes used a neighbour's bin when hers was full. This was clearly a neighbourhood-wide conspiracy against proper trash protocols. Henderson began leaving notes, not just on his own bin, but on others. "Please use only your assigned refuse container," read one. "Unauthorised garbage deposit will be reported to Waste Management Services," announced another. He signed them a concerned resident, as if he were leading some sort of underground sanitation movement. The neighbourhood WhatsApp group, previously used for lost cat announcements and book club reminders, became a forum for heated debate about trash can etiquette. Henderson created detailed posts about the importance of respecting boundaries and maintaining neighbourhood standards. Mrs. Patel, meanwhile, had moved on with her life. She bought a bigger bin, problem solved. But Henderson's crusade continued. He began photographing violations and sending them to the Homeowners Association. He created a detailed log of unauthorised trash deposits, complete with timestamps and weather conditions. The Homeowners Association president, a tired man named Tom who had signed up thinking he'd be dealing with pool maintenance and holiday decorations, found himself mediating what he would later describe as the most insane dispute of his tenure. But Henderson's trash vigilantism was far from unique. Across the nation, similar battles were being waged over the sacred sanctity of refuse containers. Consider the case of Brenda Kowalski in Toledo, Ohio, who discovered that her next-door neighbour, had been using her trash bin as overflow storage for 6 months without permission. Brenda's initial response was reasonable. She knocked on her neighbour's door and politely requested that he use only his own bin. Her neighbour, Frank, explained that his bin was too small for his family's weekly trash output. He offered to pay half of Brenda's garbage service fee in exchange for continued sharing privileges. This seemed like a practical solution to a minor problem. Brenda agreed, but only if Frank would ask permission before using her bin and limit himself to 1 bag per week. Frank agreed to these terms, and for 3 weeks the arrangement worked perfectly. Then Frank's adult son moved back home, bringing with him the garbage output of a 25-year-old who survived primarily on takeout and energy drinks. Frank began using 2 bags of Brenda's bin space, then 3, then filling it completely before she had a chance to add her own trash. Brenda arrived home from work one Thursday to find her bin overflowing with Frank's family refuse and no room for her own carefully sorted garbage. She knocked on Frank's door to discuss the situation. Frank's response was that his son's presence was temporary, maybe another month or 2, and surely Brenda could be flexible about the arrangement during this transitional period. After all, he was still paying half the garbage fee. But Brenda had paid for a specific service: weekly removal of her household waste. Frank was essentially asking her to subsidise his family's inability to manage their own trash output. The monthly payment didn't cover the inconvenience of having nowhere to put her own garbage. Brenda cancelled the arrangement and installed a small lock on her bin. Frank responded by filling his own bin to overflowing and leaving excess bags next to Brenda's bin on collection day, creating what she considered a public health hazard and neighbourhood eyesore. The Great Toledo Trash War escalated when Brenda began photographing Frank's excess garbage bags and sending complaints to the city sanitation department. Frank retaliated by filing noise complaints about Brenda's weekly yard work, claiming her leaf blower violated noise ordinances. The conflict reached its peak when Frank's son moved out, taking his excessive garbage production with him. Frank continued leaving excess bags next to Brenda's bin, apparently out of habit or spite. Brenda continued photographing and reporting the violations, apparently out of principle. A reasonable observer might expect the conflict to end when Frank's garbage output returned to normal levels. Instead, both neighbours had become so invested in their positions that they continued the documentation and complaint process long after the original problem had resolved itself. The trash can wars reveal something fundamental about human psychology and the nature of minor irritations. What begins as a practical problem often evolves into a symbolic battle about respect, boundaries, and the right to determine how shared resources are used. Henderson's reaction to Mrs. Patel's overflow bag wasn't really about garbage capacity or service fees. It was about the assumption that his resources were available for others to use without permission. The lock on his bin wasn't protecting trash, it was protecting his sense of control over his small piece of the world. Similarly, Brenda's conflict with Frank transcended practical concerns about garbage volume. It became a test of whether agreements would be honoured, whether boundaries would be respected, and whether one person's convenience would consistently trump another person's reasonable expectations. These disputes also highlight the peculiar intimacy of modern neighbourly relationships. We live close enough to observe each other's daily habits, garbage output, and household routines, but far enough apart to avoid regular meaningful interaction. The result is a strange form of surveillance-based familiarity. Henderson knew exactly when Mrs. Patel took out her trash, what her son's cleaning habits were, and how much overflow her household typically generated, but he didn't know her well enough to have a comfortable conversation about reasonable sharing arrangements. The Great Trash Can War of Elm Street ended not with reconciliation, but with Henderson moving away. His parting gesture was a laminated sign left on his locked bin. To future residents, "This bin is for your trash only. Eternal vigilance is the price of sanitation freedom." The new neighbours, a young couple with a baby, removed the lock on their first day. They also removed the sign. When Mrs. Patel came over with a welcome casserole, she mentioned that if they ever needed extra trash space, they were welcome to use her bin. The cycle of neighbourly cooperation resumed, as if Henderson's great crusade had never happened. Which raises the philosophical question: if someone fights a trash can war and everyone forgets about it, did it really matter? Henderson would say yes. It was about principles. The new neighbours would probably say no. It's about being reasonable. And Mrs. Patel would likely say it's about having better things to worry about. Chapter 3: The Property Line Paradox. Human beings, it seems, have an almost mystical relationship with invisible lines. We can't see them, we can't touch them, but we'll fight wars over them. Tonight, we examine the curious case of property boundaries and the seemingly rational adults who transform into feudal lords at the first sign of encroachment. In the quiet suburb of Maplewood Heights, there live two families separated by what cartographers call a property line, and what neighbours call a reason to never speak again. The Andersons and the Rodriguezes had been cordial neighbours for 6 years. They borrowed lawn equipment, accepted package deliveries, and exchanged pleasantries about the weather. Then came the great fence incident of last autumn. It started when the Andersons decided to install a privacy fence. Not an unreasonable desire. They had teenagers who liked to use the backyard pool, and they wanted a bit more seclusion. They hired a contractor, obtained the proper permits, and prepared to become the proud owners of 6 feet of cedar privacy. The contractor, a man named Bill who had installed hundreds of fences and thought he understood property lines, set up his equipment. He referenced the survey stakes, measured carefully, and began digging post holes exactly where the property line was marked. Mr. Rodriguez noticed the activity and wandered over to chat. Neighbours do this. It's part of the social contract. You're allowed to be curious about construction projects, especially when they're happening 3 feet from your kitchen window. "Nice fence," Rodriguez commented, examining the materials. "Cedar's a good choice. Should last 20 years easy." Anderson nodded agreeably. They discussed wood treatment, post depth, and the wisdom of cedar versus pine. It was a perfectly pleasant conversation between two reasonable men discussing a routine home improvement project. Then Rodriguez mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he thought the property line might be a few inches further toward the Anderson side. Not a big deal, he said, just something he'd noticed when he had his own survey done a few years back. Anderson, who had paid good money for a proper survey and permits, politely disagreed. The stakes were clearly marked. The contractor knew what he was doing. Everything was exactly where it should be. Rodriguez shrugged. "Probably just a difference in surveys," he said. "These things happen. Old properties, you know how it is." He wished Anderson luck with the fence and went back to his own yard work. Anderson continued with his fence installation, but Rodriguez's comment had planted a seed of doubt. Not about the fence. He was confident in his survey, but about his neighbour. Why would Rodriguez mention the property line unless he was planning something? Was this the beginning of some sort of land grab? Had Rodriguez been eyeing Anderson's property for years, waiting for the right moment to make a claim? These thoughts, like invasive weeds, began to take root in Anderson's mind. Property line disputes have a unique ability to transform rational adults into obsessive cartographers. The invisible lines that separate one person's land from another's become the most important features in their entire worldview. Consider the case of Margaret Willis and Thomas Chen, neighbours in a 1950s subdivision where property boundaries had been surveyed multiple times over 7 decades, with slightly different results each time. Margaret's deed described her lot as extending to the centre line of the existing oak tree. Thomas's deed referenced the large oak approximately 12 feet from the eastern boundary. The oak tree in question had grown significantly since 1954, and its centre line was no longer where it had been when the original survey was completed. This discrepancy created a disputed zone of approximately 8 square feet where both neighbours could claim legitimate ownership. 8 square feet. Roughly the size of a small bathroom, not enough space for a garden shed, barely enough for a small flower bed, but those 8 square feet became the focus of a 3-year legal battle that cost both neighbours more than $10,000 in surveying fees, legal consultations and mediation services. Margaret planted flowers in the disputed zone and installed a small decorative border. Thomas installed his own plants and moved Margaret's border 6 inches toward her house. Margaret hired a surveyor to precisely map the oak tree's historical centre line. Thomas hired his own surveyor to document the eastern boundary reference point. The competing surveys reached different conclusions, as surveys often do when dealing with 70-year-old reference points and naturally growing trees. Margaret's surveyor supported her claim to the disputed zone. Thomas's surveyor supported his claim. Both surveys were technically accurate and legally meaningless. The conflict escalated when Margaret installed a small garden gnome in the disputed territory. Thomas interpreted this as a provocation and responded by planting a row of marigolds that extended 2 inches into what Margaret considered her rightful property. The garden gnome war reached its peak when both neighbours began making daily inspections of the disputed zone, documenting any changes or perceived encroachments with photographs and detailed written descriptions. Margaret maintained a log of Thomas's aggressive gardening activities. Thomas kept records of Margaret's territorial expansion attempts. The resolution came when both neighbours realised they were spending more time monitoring 8 square feet of shared border than they spent enjoying their entire yards. They agreed to split the disputed zone down the middle and plant a shared garden that neither would claim exclusive ownership of. The shared garden flourished, becoming the most attractive feature of both properties. But it took 3 years and considerable legal expense to reach a solution that could have been implemented on day 1 of the dispute. Property line conflicts reveal something profound about human nature and our relationship with ownership. The boundaries that separate mine from yours often matter more to us than the actual value of what's being protected. The fence was completed on a Thursday. It was beautiful. 6 feet of cedar privacy stretching across the back of Anderson's property. His teenagers were delighted. His wife was pleased. He should have been satisfied. Instead, Anderson found himself measuring. The fence was exactly where it should be according to his survey. But what if Rodriguez was right? What if there really was a discrepancy? Anderson had put $15,000 into this fence. If it was on Rodriguez's property even by a few inches, what did that mean legally? Anderson did what any reasonable person would do in the 21st century. He went online. He researched property law, adverse possession, boundary disputes, and easement rights. He learned about hostile occupation and colour of title and statutory periods. The more he read, the more convinced he became that Rodriguez's casual comment had been a calculated move. Perhaps the beginning of a legal strategy. Maybe Rodriguez was planning to claim part of Anderson's yard through some obscure property law loophole. Anderson hired a second surveyor. The results confirmed his original survey. The fence was precisely on the property line. He felt vindicated, but also suspicious. Why had Rodriguez raised the issue in the first place? Meanwhile, Rodriguez had completely forgotten about the property line comment. He was dealing with his own home improvement project. Replacing his deck. And barely noticed that Anderson seemed to be avoiding him lately. Anderson, however, was just beginning his campaign of vigilance. He began monitoring Rodriguez's yard activities. He noticed when Rodriguez trimmed branches that might potentially overhang the property line. He observed Rodriguez's sprinkler system and wondered if any water was falling on Anderson property. He started taking photographs. The breaking point came during the first snowfall. Rodriguez was shoveling his driveway and, in the universal gesture of good neighbourliness, cleared the snow from the area directly in front of Anderson's mailbox. It was a 5-minute job, the kind of small kindness that neighbours do for each other. Anderson watched from his window and saw something different. Rodriguez was on Anderson's property. The mailbox was clearly on Anderson's side of the property line. Rodriguez had no right to be there, even if he was doing a favour. Anderson marched outside in his pyjamas and snow boots to confront this trespass. "Excuse me," he said, with the tone of a man defending his constitutional rights. "You're on my property." Rodriguez, shovel in hand, looked around in confusion. "I was just clearing your walkway," he said. "I had the snowblower out anyway." "I didn't ask you to clear my walkway," Anderson replied, "and technically you're trespassing." Rodriguez stared at his neighbour, a man he'd chatted with about fence materials just 3 months earlier, and realised he was looking at a stranger. "Are you serious?" he asked. Anderson was completely serious. He had spent months researching property law, worried about boundary disputes, and monitoring his neighbour's activities. He was not going to let this escalate any further. Rodriguez set down his shovel, walked back to his own driveway, and never spoke to Anderson again. Not out of anger, but out of a profound realisation that life was too short to waste on people who consider snow removal an act of aggression. Anderson felt victorious. He had successfully defended his property rights. Rodriguez now understood the boundaries, literally and figuratively. The victory lasted until Anderson realised that he had effectively declared war on his next-door neighbour over the clearing of snow. His wife, who had watched the confrontation from the kitchen window, asked the question that would haunt Anderson for months. What exactly did you just accomplish? Anderson couldn't answer that question then, and he probably couldn't answer it now. But he had successfully transformed a friendly neighbour into a polite stranger, and a minor property line comment into a 3-month obsession with boundary disputes. The fence still stands. It's exactly where it should be, according to 2 different surveys. Rodriguez installed his own fence the following spring. Also, exactly where it should be. The 2 fences run parallel to each other, separated by the invisible line that had caused so much trouble. Sometimes Anderson looks at those fences and wonders if Rodriguez might have been right about the property line after all, not because of the surveys. Those were clear, but because he's never quite shaken the feeling that he might have been defending the wrong thing entirely. Property line obsessions extend far beyond Anderson and Rodriguez. They represent a fundamental aspect of human territoriality that manifests in increasingly creative ways as suburban lots become smaller and neighbours live closer together. Consider the case of Emily Watson and David Kim, neighbours whose property dispute centred on a single tree branch. The branch in question extended approximately 18 inches over the property line from David's oak tree into Emily's yard. Emily discovered the encroachment while planning her vegetable garden. The overhanging branch created shade that would prevent optimal tomato growth in a 6-square-foot area of her intended garden plot. She asked David if he would trim the branch. David, who loved his oak tree and considered it the centrepiece of his landscape design, was reluctant to cut a healthy branch simply to accommodate Emily's gardening preferences. He offered to help Emily relocate her tomato plants to a sunnier area of her yard. Emily interpreted this as David refusing to address his tree's encroachment onto her property. She researched property law and learned that overhanging branches legally constituted trespass, and that property owners had the right to trim any vegetation that crossed their boundary lines. David researched tree preservation laws and discovered that his oak tree might qualify for protected status under municipal environmental ordinances. Removing major branches without proper permits could result in significant fines. What began as a discussion about 18 inches of tree branch evolved into a complex legal research project involving property rights, environmental protection laws, and municipal permit requirements. Both neighbours consulted lawyers, obtained surveys, and filed preliminary complaints with various city departments. The branch war escalated when Emily hired a tree service to trim the overhanging portion while David was at work. David returned home to find his oak tree partially pruned and Emily's contractor cleaning up the debris. David called the police to report property damage. Emily produced documentation of her legal right to trim overhanging branches. The responding officer suggested they resolve the matter through civil court rather than criminal complaints. The legal resolution took 8 months and cost both neighbours more than the value of the tomatoes Emily could have grown in the disputed 6 square feet. The oak tree survived its partial pruning. Emily's tomatoes grew successfully, and both neighbours learned that being technically correct about property rights doesn't necessarily lead to satisfying outcomes. The most remarkable aspect of property line disputes is how they transform abstract legal concepts into intensely personal battles. The invisible lines that separate one person's land from another's become more real and significant than the actual physical features of the landscape. Anderson cared more about the precise location of his property boundary than about maintaining a cordial relationship with Rodriguez. Emily prioritised her legal right to trim tree branches over preserving David's attachment to his oak tree. Both conflicts could have been resolved through simple compromise and mutual consideration. but property ownership carries a psychological weight that transcends practical considerations. The land we own represents security, investment, and identity in ways that make even minor boundary disputes feel like existential threats. Chapter 4: The Great Office Refrigerator Wars. Let us now turn our anthropological lens toward the modern workplace, that fascinating ecosystem where humans gather daily to engage in the peculiar ritual we call earning a living. Here, in the climate-controlled savanna of corporate America, we find some of the most spectacular displays of petty territorial behaviour known to science. At Consolidated Marketing Solutions, a mid-sized firm specialising in what their website calls innovative brand engagement strategies, there exists a break room. In this break room stands a refrigerator. And in this refrigerator, the fundamental principles of human civilization are tested daily. Our story begins with Linda from accounting and Derek from sales, two professionals who had coexisted peacefully in their corporate habitat for 3 years. Linda brought her lunch every day. Carefully prepared meals in labelled containers. Derek preferred to order takeout, occasionally storing leftovers for the following day. The trouble started on a Tuesday in March, when Derek opened what he believed to be his leftover pad thai from Monday night. It was, in fact, Linda's carefully prepared quinoa salad, portioned for her prescribed lunch diet and labelled Linda A, do not touch. Derek realised his mistake after the first bite. The quinoa should have been a clue. Derek had never voluntarily eaten quinoa in his life. But he was hungry. The pad thai was nowhere to be found, and he had already consumed approximately 1/3 of Linda's lunch. Derek faced a decision: confess immediately, or hope Linda wouldn't notice the missing quinoa. He chose option 3. Replace the quinoa salad with a store-bought version and hope for the best. This was Derek's first mistake. Linda knew her quinoa salad. She had perfected the recipe over months of careful experimentation. The store-bought version was an insult to her culinary standards and a transparent attempt at deception. Linda posted a note on the refrigerator. To whoever ate my lunch and replaced it with this inferior substitute, I know what happened. This behaviour is unprofessional and unacceptable. Please see me immediately to discuss reimbursement and an apology. Derek read the note with the growing dread of a man who had accidentally started a war. He could confess, apologise and hope for Linda's forgiveness, or he could pretend ignorance and hope the situation would blow over. Derek chose ignorance. This was his second mistake. Linda, receiving no response to her note, escalated. She sent an email to the entire office. It has come to my attention that we have a lunch thief among us. This person not only stole my meal, but had the audacity to replace it with a substandard substitute. I am deeply disappointed in the level of professionalism in this office. The office was divided. Some people thought Linda was overreacting. It was just lunch, after all. Others sympathised with her violation of trust. A few enterprising co-workers began placing bets on the identity of the lunch thief. Derek, meanwhile, was learning that covering up a small mistake with a larger deception was like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. Linda had launched a full investigation, complete with timestamps, refrigerator surveillance. She started checking the contents hourly, and detailed documentation of all suspicious activity. Linda began labelling her food with increasingly aggressive warnings. Linda's lunch, touch this and face consequences, followed by property of Linda A, theft will be prosecuted, and eventually, this means you, lunch thief. Derek started bringing his own lunch, hoping to avoid the refrigerator entirely. But Linda's crusade was just beginning. She installed a small camera in the break room for security purposes and began maintaining a log of who accessed the refrigerator when. The situation reached its climax when Linda scheduled a mandatory office food ethics meeting. She prepared a PowerPoint presentation about respect, boundaries, and the social contract of shared refrigerator space. She had charts showing the financial impact of lunch theft on employee morale and workplace productivity. Derek sat through this presentation like a man attending his own trial. When Linda asked if anyone had anything to confess, Derek finally cracked. "It was me," he said, standing up with the solemnity of a war criminal at Nuremberg. "I ate your quinoa salad. I thought it was my pad thai. I'm sorry." The room fell silent. Linda had won, but victory felt strangely hollow. She had spent 3 weeks, created 12 PowerPoint slides, and installed a surveillance system to catch someone who had made an honest mistake about leftover Thai food. Derek apologised profusely, reimbursed Linda for the quinoa salad, and bought lunch for the entire office as penance. Linda accepted his apology with the grace of someone who had perhaps gotten slightly carried away with the investigation process. The lunch thief crisis officially ended, but its effects lingered. The break room refrigerator now operated under what employees called Linda's Law, a complex system of labelling, dating and documentation that turned lunch storage into a bureaucratic process. New employees received a briefing about refrigerator protocols. Someone created laminated instructions for proper food storage and retrieval. The office manager requisitioned a second refrigerator to ease the pressure on shared space. Derek and Linda eventually returned to their cordial professional relationship, though Derek never quite looked at quinoa the same way again. And Linda never quite trusted the office refrigerator security system to function without active surveillance. But the Great Quinoa incident was merely the beginning of Consolidated Marketing Solutions' ongoing struggle with shared food storage conflicts. The office refrigerator had become a battleground where the fundamental principles of property, trust, and communal living were tested daily. Consider the case of Jennifer Martinez and Paul Thompson, co-workers who became embroiled in what their colleagues called the Great Coffee Creamer War of 2024. Jennifer brought her own specialty coffee creamer to work each week, storing it in the shared refrigerator for her personal use. Paul, who drank significantly more coffee than Jennifer, began using small amounts of her creamer when the office supply ran out. His reasoning was simple. Jennifer rarely used more than half her container before it expired, and he was preventing waste by utilising the excess. Jennifer noticed her creamer disappearing faster than her personal consumption could account for. She began marking the liquid level with a permanent marker, and discovered that someone was indeed using her personal coffee supplies. Jennifer's first response was to label her creamer with her name and a polite request that others not use it. Paul interpreted this as overly possessive behaviour regarding a product that would otherwise go to waste. He continued his moderate consumption, reasoning that Jennifer clearly couldn't use an entire container herself. Jennifer escalated by purchasing a small refrigerator for her desk, removing the temptation entirely. Paul responded by bringing his own creamer, but he chose the same brand and flavour as Jennifer's, creating confusion about which container belonged to whom. The coffee creamer Cold War reached its peak when both Jennifer and Paul arrived at work one morning to find their respective creamers had been accidentally switched. Paul had been using Jennifer's container for a week. while Jennifer had been unknowingly consuming Paul's identical replacement. The revelation forced both co-workers to confront the absurdity of their conflict. They had spent months monitoring, labelling and strategizing over coffee creamer consumption patterns, when a simple conversation about sharing costs and expectations could have resolved the issue immediately. The workplace refrigerator occupies a unique position in modern office dynamics. It's simultaneously public and private space, where personal property must coexist with shared resources, and individual needs must accommodate collective convenience. These conflicts reveal fundamental questions about ownership, trust, and social contracts in miniature communities. When Derek ate Linda's quinoa salad, he violated more than just her lunch plans. He disrupted her sense of security about personal property in shared spaces. Similarly, Paul's use of Jennifer's coffee creamer challenged assumptions about waste, ownership, and the boundaries of acceptable sharing in workplace environments. Both conflicts could have been prevented through clearer communication and agreed upon protocols for shared resource management. The most remarkable thing about the Great Quinoa incident was not that it happened, but that everyone in the office understood exactly why it happened. The workplace refrigerator occupies a unique space in the human psyche. It's communal property where we store private possessions, a shared resource that requires individual responsibility. It's also a place where the normal rules of ownership become blurred. Is a forgotten yogurt cup abandoned property or temporarily misplaced? Does labelling something make it more yours or just more obviously yours? And what level of response is appropriate when someone violates the sanctity of your sandwich? These questions may seem trivial, but they go to the heart of how humans navigate shared spaces and competing claims. Linda's response wasn't really about quinoa. It was about trust, respect, and the unspoken agreements that make communal living possible. Derek's mistake wasn't just eating the wrong lunch. It was failing to understand that some violations require immediate acknowledgement and repair. The cover-up, as they say, is always worse than the crime. And the office learned that even the smallest transgression can escalate into something that requires PowerPoint slides and surveillance equipment if people don't address it honestly from the beginning. The refrigerator still stands in the break room humming peacefully under its new security protocols. It has witnessed no major incidents since the Great Quinoa War, though there was a minor skirmish over coffee creamer that was resolved through diplomatic channels. But refrigerator conflicts are merely symptoms of deeper workplace dynamics about respect, boundaries, and the challenge of maintaining individual identity within collective environments. These same patterns emerge in countless other office settings, from thermostat wars to parking space hierarchies. Consider the case of Rachel Stevens and Marcus Johnson, co-workers who became embroiled in what their colleagues called the Great Microwave Timer Incident. Rachel had a habit of heating her lunch for exactly 2 minutes and 30 seconds, then walking back to her desk while the microwave completed its cycle. Marcus, who heated his lunch immediately after Rachel, would often arrive at the microwave to find it displaying 0000 with Rachel's container still inside. He would remove her food, place it on the counter and heat his own lunch. Rachel interpreted this as Marcus interfering with her lunch routine and potentially exposing her food to contamination by placing it on the possibly unsanitary counter surface. She began setting a timer on her phone to return to the microwave precisely when her heating cycle completed. Marcus found Rachel's timing obsession unreasonable and inconsiderate of other people's lunch schedules. He began heating his lunch 30 seconds before Rachel's cycle was due to complete, forcing her to wait or find alternative heating arrangements. The microwave war escalated when Rachel posted a sign requesting that people allow adequate cooling time before removing other people's food from shared appliances. Marcus responded by posting his own sign about prompt removal of personal items to maintain equitable access to shared resources. The break room began to resemble a bureaucratic battlefield, with competing posted policies about microwave etiquette, timing protocols, and food handling procedures. Colleagues found themselves navigating an increasingly complex set of unwritten rules about heating schedules and appliance access. The conflict reached its resolution when the office manager installed a second microwave, eliminating the scheduling pressure that had triggered the dispute. Rachel and Marcus never discussed their conflict directly, but they achieved a sort of détente through strategic timing and equipment avoidance. These workplace micro-conflicts reveal something important about modern office culture and the stress of maintaining personal routines within Share Section 4 of 6, Office Reflections and Holiday Dinner Crisis, approximately 18 minutes. The most remarkable thing about the Great Quinoa incident was not that it happened, but that everyone in the office understood exactly why it happened. The workplace refrigerator occupies a unique space in the human psyche. It's communal property where we store private possessions, a shared resource that requires individual responsibility. It's also a place where the normal rules of ownership become blurred. Is a forgotten yogurt cup abandoned property or temporarily misplaced? Does labelling something make it more yours, or just more obviously yours? And what level of response is appropriate when someone violates the sanctity of your sandwich? These questions may seem trivial, but they go to the heart of how humans navigate shared spaces and competing claims. Linda's response wasn't really about quinoa. It was about trust, respect, and the unspoken agreements that make communal living possible. Derek's mistake wasn't just eating the wrong lunch. It was failing to understand that some violations require immediate acknowledgement and repair. The cover-up, as they say, is always worse than the crime. And the office learned that even the smallest transgression can escalate into something that requires PowerPoint slides and surveillance equipment if people don't address it honestly from the beginning. The refrigerator still stands in the break room, humming peacefully under its new security protocols. It has witnessed no major incidents since the Great Quinoa War, though there was a minor skirmish over coffee creamer that was resolved through diplomatic channels. Chapter 5. The Holiday Dinner Diplomatic Crisis. No examination of human pettiness would be complete without venturing into the treacherous territory of family gatherings. Here, in the seemingly warm embrace of holiday traditions, we find some of the most spectacular displays of passive-aggressive warfare ever documented by social scientists. The Morrison family of Grand Rapids, Michigan, had maintained a Thanksgiving tradition for 23 years. Every fourth Thursday in November, 3 generations would gather at the home of Patricia and Robert Morrison. Parents, children, grandchildren, and occasionally brave significant others who had no idea what they were walking into. The gathering followed a carefully orchestrated ritual. Patricia prepared the turkey, her daughter Janet brought the stuffing, son Michael handled the mashed potatoes, and daughter-in-law Lisa was responsible for dessert. This system had worked flawlessly for over 2 decades. Then came the Great Cranberry Sauce incident of 2023. It started when Lisa, who had married into the family 5 years earlier, offered to expand her dessert responsibilities. "I make an excellent cranberry sauce," she mentioned during the October planning call. "It's my grandmother's recipe. Fresh cranberries, orange zest, a touch of port wine. Everyone loves it." Patricia, who had been making cranberry sauce from a can for 23 years, felt something shift in the domestic balance of power. Not that there was anything wrong with Lisa's offer, she assured everyone. It was very thoughtful. But Patricia had always handled the cranberry sauce, and it seemed unnecessary to complicate the menu at this point. Lisa, being diplomatic, suggested that perhaps they could have both versions. A little variety never hurt anyone. Patricia agreed, with the tone of someone who was being very reasonable about something that clearly bothered her. What followed was 3 weeks of what family systems therapists call triangulation, and what normal people call getting everyone else involved in your argument. Patricia mentioned to her daughter Janet that she found it interesting that Lisa felt the need to change a tradition that had worked perfectly well for decades. Was she implying that Patricia's cranberry sauce was somehow inadequate? Janet, caught between her mother and her sister-in-law, tried to remain diplomatic. "I'm sure she just wants to contribute," Janet suggested. "It's not about your cranberry sauce, Mom." But Patricia was already deep in the grip of what psychologists call threat perception, and what everyone else calls taking things way too personally. This wasn't about cranberry sauce anymore. It was about respect, tradition, and who was in charge of Thanksgiving. Meanwhile, Lisa had mentioned to her husband Michael that she was surprised by Patricia's reaction to the cranberry sauce offer. "It's just cranberries," she told him. "I was trying to be helpful." Michael, who had grown up navigating his mother's complex emotional landscape, recognised the warning signs. "Maybe just stick with dessert this year," he suggested. "Mum's been making the cranberry sauce forever. It's kind of her thing." Lisa interpreted this as her husband choosing his mother over his wife, which wasn't entirely inaccurate but wasn't entirely fair either. Michael was simply trying to prevent World War III from breaking out over a Thanksgiving side dish. The situation escalated when Patricia decided to research Lisa's cranberry sauce claims. She Googled cranberry sauce with port wine and discovered that it was, indeed, a legitimate recipe. This somehow made it worse. Lisa wasn't just being presumptuous, she was being presumptuous with actual culinary credentials. Patricia responded by purchasing premium whole berry cranberry sauce instead of her usual jellied variety. She also bought organic cranberries to make her own sauce from scratch, something she had never done in 23 years of Thanksgiving hosting. Lisa, sensing the competitive undercurrent, decided to make her cranberry sauce extra special. She sourced organic cranberries from a local farm, imported port wine from Portugal, and hand-zested oranges from California. She was going to show the Morrison family what cranberry sauce could really be. Thanksgiving Day arrived with the tension of a diplomatic summit. 2 cranberry sauces sat on the Morrison dining table like competing political parties. Patricia's homemade version. Her first attempt had turned out slightly bitter. Lisa's gourmet creation was admittedly delicious. The family, sensing the undercurrent, navigated the cranberry sauce selection with the careful neutrality of Switzerland. Everyone took a small portion of both, offered generic compliments, "This is lovely," and changed the subject as quickly as possible. But the damage was done. Patricia felt upstaged in her own home by a cranberry sauce that was, objectively, better than anything she had ever made. Lisa felt unwelcome and criticised for trying to contribute to a family tradition. The aftermath lasted 6 months. Patricia began making subtle references to people who feel the need to show off at family gatherings. Lisa stopped offering to bring anything beyond what was specifically assigned to her. Michael found himself translating between his wife and his mother like a diplomatic interpreter. The resolution came during Easter dinner, when Patricia's younger sister brought a store-bought pie to supplement the dessert table. "I know Lisa made those beautiful tarts," she said, "but I saw this key lime pie at the grocery store and couldn't resist." Patricia watched her family enthusiastically praise the store-bought pie and realised she had been defending territory that didn't need defending. The cranberry sauce war suddenly seemed as ridiculous as it actually was. She approached Lisa during dessert cleanup. "I've been thinking about Thanksgiving," she said. "Maybe we could make the cranberry sauce together this year. I'd love to learn your grandmother's recipe." Lisa, who had spent 6 months wondering if she would ever be truly welcome in the Morrison family, felt the diplomatic ice finally begin to thaw. "I'd like that," she said. "And maybe you could teach me your stuffing technique. Janet says it's impossible to replicate." The Great Cranberry Sauce war officially ended with a cooking lesson and a shared understanding that family traditions are supposed to bring people together, not drive them apart. The Morrison family learned something important about the hidden dynamics of holiday gatherings. Food isn't just food. It's love, contribution, acceptance and identity, all mixed together in a casserole dish of emotional complexity. Patricia's reaction wasn't really about cranberry sauce. It was about feeling replaced, diminished, or criticised in the role she had filled for over 2 decades. Lisa's persistence wasn't about proving her culinary skills. It was about finding her place in a family that had functioned without her for years before she arrived. Holiday gatherings are unique pressure cookers where normal family dynamics get intensified by expectations, traditions, and the peculiar stress of trying to create perfect memories while managing imperfect people. The anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss wrote extensively about the social function of shared meals, but he probably never witnessed a multi-generational argument about cranberry sauce preparation methods. If he had, he might have added a chapter about how food becomes a symbol for everything we can't say directly to the people we love most. The Morrison family still gathers every Thanksgiving. They now have 3 different cranberry sauce options: Patricia's traditional version, Lisa's gourmet creation, and a rotating selection contributed by various family members. The table is more crowded, but the conversation is easier. Chapter 6: The Workplace Bathroom Paper Towel Rebellion. In the corporate offices of Midwest Insurance Group, a rebellion was brewing. Not over wages, working conditions, or management policies. No, this uprising concerned something far more fundamental to human dignity: the quality of bathroom paper towels. Our protagonist is Sandra Chen, a claims processor with 15 years of experience and very specific opinions about absorbency standards. The antagonist was the company's new cost-cutting initiative, which had replaced the perfectly adequate brown paper towels with what Sandra described as tissue-thin mockeries of proper hand-drying materials. The new paper towels were admittedly terrible. They had the absorbency of plastic wrap and the durability of wet newspaper. Employees found themselves using 6 or 7 towels to accomplish what one decent towel had previously achieved. Sandra calculated the mathematics of inefficiency. If each employee needed 5 extra towels per bathroom visit, and there were 87 employees making an average of 3 bathroom visits per day, the company was actually spending more money on towels while providing inferior service. She presented this analysis to her supervisor, Tom, who agreed that the towels were inadequate, but explained that facilities decisions were made by corporate headquarters, not local management. "My hands are tied," he said, inadvertently making a pun that Sandra did not find amusing. Sandra decided to take matters into her own hands, literally. She began bringing her own paper towels to work. Not just a few extra sheets, but an entire roll, which she stored in her desk drawer like some sort of absorbency contraband. She would take her personal towel supply to the bathroom, use one high-quality towel to dry her hands, and return to her desk satisfied with the job properly done. Word of Sandra's paper towel rebellion spread through the office with the speed of any good workplace gossip. Some employees admired her initiative, others found it excessive. A few began bringing their own towels in solidarity. The bathroom towel situation evolved into a complex underground economy. Sandra became the unofficial supplier of premium paper towels for employees who had grown tired of the corporate-approved tissue paper. She bought towels in bulk and sold them at cost to her co-workers. Tom, the supervisor, found himself in the awkward position of managing an employee who was essentially running an unlicensed paper goods business out of her desk drawer. Technically, Sandra wasn't violating any company policies. There was no specific rule against bringing your own bathroom supplies to work. But corporate headquarters noticed the unusual pattern in paper towel ordering. The local office was going through significantly more towels than other locations. Despite having the same number of employees, they sent a facilities consultant to investigate. The consultant, an earnest young man named Brad who took his towel expertise very seriously, spent 3 days analysing bathroom usage patterns, interviewing employees, and measuring towel consumption rates. His report concluded that the Midwest Insurance Group office had developed an atypical paper towel usage culture. Brad's recommendations included installing automatic towel dispensers that would limit employees to 2 towels per activation, employee education about proper hand-drying techniques, and posted reminders about cost-conscious resource management. Sandra read these recommendations with the growing indignation of someone whose reasonable request for decent paper towels had triggered a corporate efficiency audit. She had tried to work within the system. She had presented logical arguments. She had even calculated cost-benefit analyses. The company's response was to install towel rationing devices and lecture employees about hand-drying methodology. Sandra's paper towel operation evolved into full-scale civil disobedience. She began leaving high-quality towels in the bathroom for general use. Anonymous gifts of absorbency for her fellow employees. She posted information about bulk paper towel purchasing on the office bulletin board. She organised a group order for premium towels through a wholesale supplier. The Great Paper Towel War reached its climax when corporate headquarters decided to conduct a surprise audit of the local office. They were looking for evidence of wasteful spending, inefficient resource management, and non-compliance with facilities policies. What they found was an office that had somehow managed to maintain perfect productivity levels while consuming 40% more paper towels than any other location. They also discovered Sandra's desk drawer, which contained enough premium paper towels to supply a small restaurant. Sandra was called into a meeting with Tom, a human resources representative, and a corporate facilities manager. They wanted to understand her unusual relationship with bathroom supplies. Sandra, who had spent months thinking about this moment, delivered what employees would later call the Great Paper Towel Speech. She explained that decent hand-drying materials were not a luxury but a basic workplace necessity. She presented her cost-efficiency analysis. She discussed employee morale, dignity, and the relationship between working conditions and productivity. She concluded by asking a simple question. Why would a profitable company choose to provide its employees with paper towels that don't actually dry hands? The corporate facilities manager, who had spent his career optimizing costs and measuring efficiency, found himself without a good answer to Sandra's question. The cheap towels were cheaper per unit, but they clearly weren't cheaper per hand-drying event. Six weeks later, Midwest Insurance Group upgraded to medium-quality paper towels throughout all their locations. Sandra's cost-efficiency analysis had been forwarded to corporate headquarters and incorporated into their facility standards. Sandra became something of a legend in the company. The woman who revolutionized bathroom supplies through sheer persistence and mathematical analysis. New employees heard the story as part of their unofficial orientation about workplace culture and the importance of standing up for reasonable standards. The paper towel rebellion had lasted 8 months, involved 4 different corporate departments, and generated enough documentation to fill a filing cabinet, all over the fundamental question of whether employees deserved towels that actually absorbed moisture. Sandra still works at Midwest Insurance Group, and she still brings her own premium paper towels to work. Not because she needs to anymore, but because old habits die hard, and because she's developed what she calls towel trust issues with corporate decision-making. The bathroom now stocks decent paper towels, automatic dispensers have been removed, and employees dry their hands with the dignity that Sandra believed they deserved all along. Chapter 7. The Great Lawn Mowing Frequency Dispute. In the suburban kingdom of Willowbrook Estates, where homeowners association bylaws carry the weight of constitutional amendments, there lived 2 men whose conflicting philosophies about grass maintenance would test the very foundations of neighbourly cooperation. Meet Gerald Hoffman, 58, retired engineer, and his next-door neighbour, Kevin Walsh, 34, marketing manager and father of 2. Gerald maintained his lawn with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. Weekly mowing, bi-weekly fertilising, and daily inspection for signs of weed infiltration or irregular growth patterns. Kevin, meanwhile, subscribed to what he called the reasonable person approach to lawn care. Mow when the grass looks long, water when it looks dry, and spend the rest of his weekend time with his family rather than pursuing horticultural perfection. The trouble began in late May, when Kevin's grass reached what Gerald considered unacceptable length. Gerald's lawn stood at a uniform 2 3/4 inches. The optimal height according to his extensive research into turfgrass management. Kevin's grass had reached nearly 4 inches in some areas. Gerald's first approach was diplomatic. He mentioned during a chance encounter at the mailbox that Kevin's lawn was getting a bit tall, and offered to lend him his spare mower if Kevin's was broken. Kevin, who had been planning to mow that weekend anyway, thanked Gerald for the offer but explained that his mower was fine. He just hadn't gotten around to using it yet. Different people, he suggested with a smile, had different schedules and priorities. Gerald interpreted this as a fundamental philosophical challenge to proper lawn maintenance standards. Different priorities. Grass grew at the same rate for everyone. There were objective standards for acceptable lawn length. This wasn't a matter of personal preference. It was about community standards and property values. Gerald began monitoring Kevin's mowing schedule with the dedication of a climate researcher tracking seasonal patterns. Kevin mowed approximately every 10 to 12 days, depending on weather conditions and family obligations. Gerald mowed every Saturday morning at 8:30 a.m, regardless of whether the grass actually needed cutting. The Homeowners Association bylaws specified that lawns must be properly maintained but didn't define specific length requirements or mowing frequency. Gerald decided this was an oversight that needed correction. He attended the next HOA meeting with a detailed presentation about standardising community lawn care expectations. He had charts showing the relationship between grass length and property values, photographs comparing well-maintained and neglected lawns, and specific recommendations for maximum acceptable grass height. Gerald's presentation was thorough, professional, and focused entirely on Kevin's lawn, without mentioning Kevin by name. He used phrases like certain properties and inconsistent maintenance standards, while projecting photographs that clearly showed Kevin's house. The HOA board, composed of volunteers who had signed up thinking they'd be dealing with pool maintenance and holiday decorations, found themselves mediating a dispute over grass height measurements. They agreed to review community lawn care standards and consider additional guidelines if necessary. Kevin, who learned about Gerald's presentation through the neighbourhood gossip network, was initially amused. Then he realised that Gerald was serious about legislating lawn mowing frequency, and amusement turned to irritation. Kevin's response was to research the actual HOA bylaws and discover that Gerald's own lawn care practices might violate existing guidelines. The bylaws prohibited excessive noise before 9 AM on weekends, and Gerald's weekly 8:30 AM mowing sessions technically qualified as a violation. Kevin submitted a formal complaint to the HOA about Gerald's early morning mowing schedule, not because the noise actually bothered him, but because Gerald had turned lawn care into a legal battleground. What followed was 6 months of escalating bureaucratic warfare. Gerald documented Kevin's grass length with weekly photographs. Kevin filed noise complaints about Gerald's mowing schedule. Gerald researched municipal ordinances about property maintenance. Kevin contacted a lawyer about HOA overreach and harassment. The homeowners association meetings became community theatre, with neighbours taking sides based on their own lawn care philosophies. The Gerald faction believed in strict maintenance standards and community appearance codes. The Kevin faction advocated for reasonable personal freedom and priority flexibility. The war reached its peak when Gerald installed a sprinkler system designed to keep his grass at optimal health while ensuring that no water accidentally benefited Kevin's lawn. Kevin responded by planting wildflowers along the property line. Natural landscaping that required no mowing at all. Gerald's wildflower counter strategy was to research municipal weed ordinances and file a complaint about Kevin's uncontrolled vegetation. Kevin's response was to hire a landscaping company to install native prairie grass that was specifically protected under environmental conservation laws. The Great Lawn War officially ended when both men received citations from the city for filing frivolous municipal complaints. The Homeowners Association, exhausted by months of grass-related litigation, passed a resolution stating that all lawn care disputes should be resolved through neighbourly communication rather than bureaucratic processes. Gerald and Kevin never reconciled, but they achieved a sort of détente. Gerald continued his weekly mowing ritual. Kevin maintained his reasonable person approach, and both men learned to avoid eye contact during mailbox encounters. The neighbourhood eventually returned to normal, though new residents receive an informal briefing about the Great Lawn War as part of their welcome process. The HOA bylaws now include a specific clause about reasonable lawn care expectations, and a prohibition on photography-based complaints about grass length. Gerald still maintains the most precisely manicured lawn in Willowbrook Estates. Kevin's grass still grows at its own pace, mowed when family schedules permit. Both lawns are perfectly acceptable by any reasonable standard. But the real lesson of the Great Lawn War wasn't about grass height or mowing frequency. It was about what happens when personal preferences become moral imperatives, and when the desire for community standards transforms into a crusade against anyone who does things differently. Gerald wanted everyone to share his passion for lawn perfection. Kevin wanted the freedom to prioritise his time according to his own values. Neither request was unreasonable until it became a demand that the other person change their behaviour to match their preferences. Chapter 8. The Office Thermostat Cold War. In the climate-controlled environment of Pinnacle Financial Services, where the ambient temperature was supposed to create optimal working conditions for 43 employees, a battle was raging that would make the actual Cold War seem like a minor diplomatic disagreement. The combatants were Margaret Thompson, 52, senior accountant who maintained a sweater collection specifically for office wear, and James Rodriguez, 28, junior analyst who had never met an air conditioning setting he couldn't improve upon. Margaret believed the office was perpetually freezing. She arrived each morning wearing layers that could sustain her through an Arctic expedition, and spent her day monitoring the thermostat like a vigilant guardian of reasonable temperature standards. James believed the office was perpetually stifling. He had calculated that optimal productivity occurred at 68 degrees Fahrenheit, and he had appointed himself the unofficial temperature optimization specialist for the entire floor. The thermostat was located in the hallway between their respective workstations, making it accessible to both parties and creating what military strategists would call contested territory. Margaret would arrive at 8 a.m. and immediately adjust the thermostat to 74 degrees. James would arrive at 8:30 a.m., notice the temperature setting, and reduce it to 68 degrees. Margaret would discover this change during her 10 a.m. coffee break and readjust to 72 degrees as a compromise. James would counter-adjust to 69 degrees during his lunch break. This thermal chess match continued for weeks, with each player developing increasingly sophisticated strategies. Margaret began arriving 15 minutes early to ensure temperature advantage. James started making multiple thermostat adjustments throughout the day, timing them to Margaret's meeting schedule. Other employees began to notice the temperature fluctuations. Some days the office felt like a tropical greenhouse, other days like a refrigerated warehouse. People started keeping extra sweaters at their desks and small personal fans in their drawers. Margaret escalated by sending an email to the office manager. I would like to request a review of our climate control policies. The current temperature settings are creating an uncomfortable working environment that affects productivity and employee health. James responded with his own email, including attached research about optimal office temperatures and worker performance. Studies show that cognitive function decreases significantly in overheated environments. I believe our current temperature settings may be impacting team efficiency. The office manager, a weary woman named Carol who had dealt with everything from printer disputes to coffee pot politics, now found herself mediating what she would later describe as the most passive-aggressive conflict of her career. Carol's solution was to install a programmable thermostat with a locked cover. The temperature would be set to a compromise 71 degrees and maintained consistently throughout the day. No more manual adjustments. No more temperature warfare. Margaret and James both declared victory, which should have been the end of the story. Instead, it was the beginning of Phase 2, the Great Space Heater and Personal Fan Arms Race. Margaret purchased a small space heater for under her desk. James bought a desktop fan with variable speed settings. Margaret upgraded to a larger heater with a timer function. James acquired a tower fan with oscillation features and a remote control. The office began to resemble a small appliance showroom. Other employees, inspired by the climate control innovations, began purchasing their own temperature modification devices. The break room became a staging area for boxes from various home goods retailers. The electrical system, which had been designed for computers and office equipment, began struggling with the additional load from dozens of personal climate control devices. Circuit breakers started tripping. The IT department issued warnings about power consumption and fire hazards. Carol called an all-staff meeting about personal appliance policies and electrical safety standards. She explained that the office electrical system couldn't support everyone's individual climate preferences, and that personal heating and cooling devices would need to be regulated. Margaret argued that her space heater was a medical necessity. She couldn't work effectively in cold conditions, and it was the employer's responsibility to provide a comfortable working environment. James countered that his fan was essential for maintaining the air circulation needed for optimal cognitive performance. The Great Thermostat War evolved into a complex negotiation involving human resources, facilities management, and occupational safety specialists. Policies were drafted about acceptable personal appliances, electrical load limits, and procedures for temperature-related accommodation requests. The final resolution involved installing individual temperature controls at each workstation, a costly upgrade that the company hadn't planned to make for another 5 years. Margaret could now maintain her preferred 74-degree microclimate, while James could enjoy his optimal 68-degree environment. Both employees expressed satisfaction with the outcome, though neither acknowledged that their 6-month temperature battle had cost the company approximately $15,000 in electrical upgrades and lost productivity from temperature-related distractions. Chapter 9. The Social Media Comment Section Uprising. In the digital realm of social media, where human interactions are filtered through screens and mediated by algorithms, we find some of the purest examples of petty conflict evolution. Here, minor disagreements can metastasize into multi-platform wars that consume days of people's lives over issues that no one will remember next week. Our story begins on the Facebook page of the Riverside Community Garden, a peaceful group dedicated to sharing gardening tips, seasonal advice, and photographs of successful vegetable harvests. It was the kind of online space that should have been immune to controversy. After all, how contentious can discussions about tomato varieties really become? The answer, as we shall see, is extraordinarily contentious. The incident began when longtime group member Dorothy Kellerman posted a photograph of her prized tomato plant, accompanied by the caption, "My beefsteak tomatoes are coming along beautifully. Nothing beats the classic varieties for flavour and reliability." This innocent statement about tomato preferences would have passed unnoticed in any reasonable world, but this was social media, where innocent statements go to die. Within 30 minutes, another group member named Steve Palkowski had replied, "Actually, heirloom varieties have much better flavour profiles than modern hybrids. You might want to try some Cherokee Purples or Brandywines if you're interested in real tomato taste." Steve meant this as helpful advice. Dorothy interpreted it as a criticism of her gardening choices and an implication that she didn't know what real tomato taste meant after 40 years of growing vegetables. Dorothy's response was carefully worded but clearly irritated. "I've been growing tomatoes since before heirloom varieties were trendy. Beefsteaks have been reliable producers for decades, which is why experienced gardeners stick with them." Steve, reading this reply during his lunch break, detected what he interpreted as condescension about trendy heirlooms, and a suggestion that his gardening experience was somehow inferior to Dorothy's. His counter-response included a detailed explanation of the agricultural history of heirloom tomatoes, which predated hybrid varieties by centuries, links to 3 articles about flavour compounds in different tomato types, and a subtle suggestion that gardeners who prioritised reliability over flavour might be missing the point of home cultivation. Other group members began to notice the escalating tomato debate. Some offered diplomatic comments about how all tomatoes are wonderful, and everyone has their preferences. Others chose sides based on their own gardening philosophies or personal relationships with the combatants. The tomato discussion thread grew to 47 comments over 3 days. Participants included master gardeners with decades of experience, weekend hobbyists with strong opinions, and several people who didn't actually grow tomatoes but had read articles about them online. Dorothy felt that Steve had hijacked her innocent celebration of a successful harvest to promote his own gardening agenda. Steve felt that Dorothy was dismissing valuable information and perpetuating misconceptions about tomato varieties. The conflict expanded beyond Facebook when Dorothy mentioned the exchange during her weekly visit to the local garden centre. The staff there knew both Dorothy and Steve as regular customers, and the story spread through the local gardening community like a particularly aggressive variety of bindweed. Steve, meanwhile, had shared screenshots of the Facebook exchange in a private gardening group, seeking validation for his position about heirloom tomato superiority. Members of that group began joining the Riverside Community Garden Facebook page specifically to support Steve's stance. The Great Tomato Debate reached its climax when someone created a poll asking group members to vote on their preferred tomato varieties. Dorothy's beefsteaks received 32 votes. Steve's heirlooms received 34 votes. The margin was so close that both sides claimed victory. New members began joining the group attracted by rumours of the tomato controversy. The page's membership increased by 40% in 2 weeks, though most of the new members were there for entertainment rather than gardening advice. The Riverside Community Garden moderators, volunteers who had signed up to approve photos of vegetable harvests, now found themselves mediating heated debates about agricultural history, heirloom seed preservation, and the commercialisation of home gardening. They implemented new group rules, no criticism of other members' plant choices, no unsolicited growing advice unless specifically requested, and a general prohibition on variety superiority arguments. Dorothy and Steve never directly reconciled, but they achieved a sort of digital détente. Dorothy continued posting photos of her beefsteak tomatoes, now with comments disabled. Steve focused his heirloom advocacy on other gardening groups where his expertise was more welcome. The Great Tomato War officially ended when both participants became too embarrassed by the attention their conflict had generated, but the Riverside Community Garden Facebook page never quite returned to its previous peaceful state. Chapter 10. The Conclusion of Human Pettiness. And so we reach the end of our journey through the curious landscape of human conflict, where parking spaces become battlegrounds, trash cans transform into territorial markers, and tomato varieties can trigger social media warfare. What have we learned from these chronicles of everyday pettiness? Perhaps that the capacity for taking small things seriously is not a bug in human nature, but a feature. We are creatures who create meaning from the mundane, who find significance in the supposedly insignificant. Harold and Susan, still waging their traffic cone war, are not really fighting about parking spaces. They are engaged in the fundamental human struggle for respect, recognition, and control over their small piece of the world. Margaret and Derek, reconciled over quinoa salad but forever changed by their refrigerator conflict, discovered that trust is built in small moments and broken in smaller ones. The office lunch thief crisis wasn't about food. It was about honesty, accountability, and the invisible agreements that make communal living possible. The Morrison family learned that holiday traditions are not just about maintaining the past, but about making space for the future. Patricia and Lisa's cranberry sauce war ended when they realised that love should multiply possibilities, not limit them. Gerald and Kevin, still maintaining their lawns according to very different philosophies, represent the eternal tension between community standards and individual freedom. Their grass-length battle was really about who gets to decide what normal looks like. And Dorothy and Steve, whose tomato variety debate spread across multiple platforms and communities, showed us how the internet can transform minor disagreements into major productions, complete with audiences, sides, and lasting digital records. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about all these conflicts is not how ridiculous they seem, but how understandable they are once you dig beneath the surface. Every petty feud contains the seeds of deeper human needs, the desire to be heard, respected, understood, and accommodated. We live in close proximity to other humans in ways our ancestors never did. We share workspaces, neighbourhoods, digital platforms, and family gatherings with people who have different priorities, different standards, and different ways of moving through the world. Most of the time, we manage these differences through compromise, tolerance, and the mutual recognition that other people's preferences are as valid as our own. But sometimes, when we're tired or stressed or feeling unheard in other areas of our lives, we choose the hill we want to die on. And sometimes that hill is 18 inches of parking space, or the proper preparation of cranberry sauce, or the correct height for suburban grass. The anthropologist Margaret Mead once observed that the measure of civilization is how a society treats its most vulnerable members. But perhaps we could add that the measure of individual wisdom is how seriously we take our own pet peeves and whether we can recognise when our principles have become prisons. Harold could have parked somewhere else. Dorothy could have ignored Steve's tomato advice. Gerald could have focused on his own lawn instead of Kevin's. Margaret could have brought better lunches instead of installing surveillance equipment. But they didn't, because they were human beings navigating the complex social ecosystem of modern life, where every interaction is an opportunity for misunderstanding, and where the smallest conflicts can reveal the deepest truths about who we are and what we value. In the end, these stories of human pettiness are also stories of human connection. We fight with the people we encounter regularly. Neighbours, co-workers, family members. Because we have to find ways to coexist with them. The parking space wars, trash can battles, and cranberry sauce conflicts are all attempts to establish the rules of engagement for daily life. They're negotiations about respect, boundaries, and the invisible social contracts that make civilization possible. Sometimes these negotiations go badly. Sometimes minor preferences become major principles. Sometimes reasonable people become unreasonable about unreasonable things. But they also represent the fundamentally hopeful human belief that our differences can be resolved, that other people can be persuaded to see reason, and that the world can be made to operate according to better standards. Even if those standards happen to involve the proper placement of traffic cones or the optimal frequency of lawn maintenance. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, remember that somewhere, someone is probably engaged in a passionate debate about something that will seem completely absurd to everyone except the people involved in it. And remember that the capacity for caring deeply about seemingly small things is part of what makes us beautifully, ridiculously, endlessly human. Sweet dreams, and may your parking spaces be uncontested, your trash cans be respected, and your lawn be maintained to whatever standard brings you peace. The end.